Okay, could everybody just get to your seats, and if you don't mind, it'd be easier to see the screen if you move to this side of the room. Okay, we have to, we're trying to make this also available for people on Zoom, so I'm going to be speaking. Hope you can all hear me. Okay, well, thank you everyone for coming on this beautiful Saturday where I know people could be outside doing all sorts of things. But my name is Susan Jhirad, and I'm a member of the Unitarian Universalist Church of Medford, also Housing Medford and Safe Medford. Welcome to the Affordable Housing Forum, co-sponsored by the UU Church of Medford and the Greater Boston Interfaith organization. This is a group that we joined about a year ago, which is composed of approximately 68 mosques, churches, and synagogues who decided that their biggest issue, one of their three biggest issues, was the lack of affordable housing, which I think you all understand about. Clearly, we're in the midst of a serious housing crisis in Medford and everywhere around, as both rents and the prices of houses have skyrocketed and become totally unaffordable. In our own church, we've had members who have had trouble paying their rent and who periodically have become homeless, and also people who had to move out of Medford because of the lack of affordable housing. Just speaking personally, and it's sad to say this, but I'm old enough to remember when there was such a thing as rent control. And in Manhattan, where I lived, I paid in the late 60s, my roommate and I paid $120 a month for a 2-bedroom on the Upper West Side. And later in Cambridge, we also had rent control, and our rent was probably something similar to that. And even though we were of low income at that time, we never had to worry about housing. On another note, my husband and I bought a very rundown two-family house in Somerville, our first house, for $30,000 with some money that we got from my grandmother, who never owned a house in her life, lived in an apartment in the Bronx. We looked on Zillow recently, and this house, which was nothing special, was now being put into condominiums. The apartment we lived in was a condo that was selling for $995,000, and the apartment below, which was really tiny, was selling for $650,000, the condo. So it's just incredible what's going on. So today we plan to hear from actually 5 speakers, maybe 6, because our speakers have multiplied. First, Matt Leming, who is a member of our church. He's an AI researcher at Mass General Hospital and a member of our church UUCM Social Justice Committee, as well as Housing Medford and the Community Preservation Committee. Roberta Cameron is a longtime former planning consultant. She now staffs the Somerville Community Preservation Committee, is chair of Medford's Community Preservation Committee, and a founding member of Housing Medford. Bill Jones is a lay leader at First Parish Cambridge and co-chair of Greater Boston Interfaith Organization Affordable Housing Committee, advocating for affordable housing at the state level. We had hoped to have some of the tenants who were recently evicted from their housing, but they had a rally this morning. Someone became ill, she couldn't come, but we now have Katie McCann, who has worked with them as a tenant organizer for City Life in Medford, a community organizer for City Life, Leader Urbana, and the lead organizer working with tenants associations in Malden, Medford, and Everett. And we've just been joined by Eduardo Palacios, who is also a member of City Life. They fight evictions and are also working for rent control. And we're going to have a statement from Kristen Welliver, who is one of the 3 remaining tenants at the Bradlee Road complex fighting eviction. So after hearing from the speakers, both in person and on Zoom, and hello to people who are joining us on Zoom, there'll be time for questions and answers, and finally coffee and refreshments in our social hall to my left. On a practical matter, the bathroom is also through the door to my left. You just go through the door and take an immediate right. We also have some information available on the front table there for those having some problems with their current housing situation. And I'd like to take a moment to recognize officials who have kindly joined us today. Please stand Zach Bears, our city councilor, and Kit Collins, also on our city council. So welcome and thank you for joining us today. And thank you for coming to the rally. That was great. It's a wonderful rally. So up first is Matt, who's going to give us a picture of the crisis, what's caused it, and what we can do about it.
Thank you, Susan. Let's see about. Hello, my name is Matt Leming. I'm a member here of the UU Church, as well as Housing Medford and the CPC. And what I'm here to talk about today is one angle from which this housing problem can be approached. So my co-speakers are going to talk about this very complicated issue from a lot of different angles, but what I'm going to talk about is the finances of it. So if you go on Zillow, you could see, I went on Zillow over the summer and I saw that United States home values rose about 18% in the last year. The average home value in the US is $355,000. Of course, in Boston itself, it's much higher. Medford, it's like $800,000 these days. And looking at this, you may think, okay, what caused this? Was it some recent decision? Did some banker do something that caused this, that caused home values to suddenly skyrocket? The message that I'd really like to leave with everybody and really go over today is the fact that this is not a phenomenon that resulted from decisions made in the last 5 or 10 years, but this is a phenomenon that has been in the making for decades and decades. And we are just on the tail end of history when we're seeing this. So what I'm going to do for about half my talk is go over this graph. And I apologize to some of you in the back if you can't quite see some of this, please come up. But basically what this graph is it shows the, just going to turn off the like descriptions here. What this graph shows is the home price to median income ratios in the US and the UK from 1946, the end of the Second World War, and basically the beginning of the modern era, to today, 2022. What this graph shows is a lot of things that we sort of know to intuitively be true. So housing today is completely unaffordable. There was the housing bubble in which housing prices got to be extremely high. And many people that purchased houses purchased them in the early 2000s, late 90s, which according to this was the last time that they were affordable by any stretch of the imagination. But I want to go over this graph in detail to sort of explain from the financial demand side perspective, exactly what happened. And the first year is very interesting. So 1946, this was the year after the end of the Second World War. What was happening then? Well, a lot of countries in Europe and Asia had their infrastructure decimated as a result of the Second World War. So what happened then was governments of these countries got together and said, okay, we should take responsibility for housing. It is our job to make sure that people have a place to live, and we're going to do that. And so within the US specifically, around this time, 40% of mortgages were federally subsidized. It was the federal government that said, it is our job to make sure that people own homes, that people have a place to live. Okay. Additionally, around the 1950s, this was another force that was happening. This was when the Cold War began. So the US was competing with the Soviets with a communist system, which was purporting to say, we're going to take care of everybody. And the US competing with them said, okay, we need to also prove that we are capable of taking care of our own, that all of our citizens can be homeowners, etc. Okay, so this attitude of the government taking responsibility for people being homeowners worked out pretty well for a while. From about 1945 to 1970, we saw a very solid, sustained period of economic growth. And it was a cycle that went something like this. People consume more. Therefore, if they consume more, they want more goods and services. If they want more goods and services, there's more demand. Businesses want to expand. They get more productive credit. Therefore, with more productive credit, there's more increased investment in gross domestic product. Therefore, there's higher wages. People get paid more. They want to consume more. And this is a cycle that went on for a long time and led to a sustained period of economic growth in the US. What happened? What changed? A couple of things. So in the 1970s, you'll see that this graph gets a little bit more shaky. There's a lot more economic booms and busts going on. A few things contribute to this. One, there's the collapse of the international gold standard, Bretton Woods. So the price of gold starts to skyrocket. We have a dicey relationship with Iran, which leads to oil prices and just really out of control inflation. And what this leads to in the 70s is government regulation falling out of favor and a new class of economic thought, neoliberalism, emerging, which people were basically saying all of these booms and busts are due to the government regulating the economy. They're doing that too much. Something needs to change. At the same time, you have a lot more laws being passed, like California Proposition 13, which make real estate land a lot more attractive to own. Lower property taxes make housing a very attractive asset class. The intention behind this is so that families are more able to afford land, are more able to afford homes. But with this, the effect this also had was it made land much more attractive to speculators. So around the 1980s is when this class of economic thought of deregulation really starts to get implemented. So we start to elect politicians that really buy into this way of thinking. And you can see a couple of things, you can see a couple of historic events happen. Reagan's 1985 budget removed funding for any new public housing, and the US later on ended up making hard caps on how much public housing could even be made available. Within Great Britain, Margaret Thatcher sold off 1.5 million publicly owned homes and made them totally private. So there's this trend of the government saying it is no longer our responsibility to make sure people own homes. We're going to start privatizing that, stop being involved, put that in the private sector. And this continues. In the 1990s, these incentives just keep on building up. So the Soviet Union collapsed. The federal government therefore said, we no longer have to compete with the communist system. We've won, we've proven our case. And so they start shifting the burden of mortgages to private banks. And private banks on their end are more than happy to do this, because suddenly with different events like globalization, the repeal of Glass-Steagall, which gives bankers access to way more money, they suddenly have a lot more money to play with, and they say, okay, we are more than willing to start funding mortgages and kind of take this off the government. So what this leads to is competition among the private banks to put as much mortgage credit out there as possible. And this is about where we hit the 1990s, where, for a while it works out, housing prices do get fairly low. But this is also a little bit dangerous, because what happens when the private banks start to shove out as much money as possible, as much mortgage credit as possible, is we get into not a healthy growth cycle, but an inflation cycle. So it looks something like this: more mortgage credit, and I apologize to those who are live, but if you can't, if this text is a little bit small, I'm going to try to describe it as best as I can. More mortgage credit leads to increased housing prices. That's inflation. More mortgage credit also leads to an increased debt burden. People take out more credit, they get they take on more debt. If people are under this crushing debt, they consume less. This is this part of the cycle. If people consume less, companies get less profits. If companies don't have as much profits, wages stagnate and there's reduced demand for the productive credit. People don't get paid as much. They need more credit to be able to buy homes. Therefore, there's more mortgage credit. So this is a cycle. It's a cycle that continues, and it continued in the 1990s up until the housing bubble, the Great Recession, which is in much more recent memory for many of us. There are, of course, a number of forces that were contributing to this, like collateralized debt obligations, if you want to get into that. But the way that this was combated is Dodd-Frank was passed. A lot of the companies that were engaging in these practices were bailed out and a complete economic collapse was prevented. And so as a result of that, we averted that economic collapse and housing prices were sort of artificially low for a while. Banks were encouraged to keep interest rates low, but now we're seeing that that situation is changing. And so what's happening now is we're not in this healthy economic growth cycle like we saw post-World War II. We're in this kind of much more long-term, much more, I would say, dangerous, higher peaks and lower lows growth cycle that is being caused by basically the privatization of a lot of capital. Again, this is one way to view the housing crisis and the housing situation that we're on today, but I think it's a very important one. Okay, and this is why when I go on to Zillow, you end up seeing the very tail end of that graph I just showed. Housing prices increased 18% over the past year. This leads to a question: what can we do about it? So the next couple of slides, in a lot of ways, are just going to set up the vocabulary for the speakers that are going to follow me. A lot of these problems were brought about by legislative practices. It was certain laws that were passed which got us here in the first place, and the relationship between the federal government, the state government, and local governments and poor practices just on all levels is a lot of that. It's a very complicated relationship, but that's a lot of what led us to this current crisis. So what I'm going to do over the next couple of slides is just give you a description, very high level description of how these three levels of government have control over the housing market and what you can do, who you can contact if you want to get involved. Okay. Federal government. What does the federal government do about housing? And this is an incomplete list. It's very complicated, but these are just some very boiled down, simplified points. The first thing they do, and what I think is most important, is regulation of and influence on the financial industry. That's what I've been talking about for the last 15 minutes or so. They also administer the Department of Housing and Urban Development. This is the department that administers Section 8, public housing, and so on. And they provide funding for affordable housing development. This is something that they did a lot more in the middle part of the 20th century than later. And providing funding for housing development is a huge part of the government's involvement in affordable housing. What do you do if you want to make any changes at the federal government level? So I'm just including these slides here, and I apologize for if you're watching this live, this projector has some off color kind of, there's a bit of a weird color profile, but basically the point that I'm trying to make here is that at the federal government, there are a number of elected representatives in office at any given time that you vote on. These are their pictures, these are their phone numbers. If you have an issue with housing, if you want to make any change, these are the folks that should be on speed dial for you. Call them. They do take your calls into account. They are considerate of you in that way, depending on a number of different things. State government. What does the state government do about housing? They make rules about local building policy, zoning. So can you build a single family home here that can only house like 4 people, or can you build a huge apartment complex here that can house more people? And just as importantly, they allow communities to make their own rules about housing. So the state government kind of tells local governments what they can and cannot do. They allow communities to raise money in the form of property taxes. So or a number of different kinds of taxes. So again, a lot of this kind of state government telling the local government what they can't do, and then the local government implementing a number of those things. They provide state funding and they distribute federal funding and tenant protection. So it was the Massachusetts state government that put a moratorium on, for instance, people being evicted during COVID. These are your state representatives. We have the governor and the attorney general, the state senator Pat Jehlen, who's who has been doing a lot of good work within the legislature on housing, in particular, very nice law that allows tenants currently renting a house to get sort of first bids whenever the landlord wants to sell that off. So we do have good folk in there. And depending on which part of Medford you live in, one of 3 state representatives, Barber, Donato, or Bradlee. Again, their phone numbers are up here, their pictures are up here. They are people. You should have a conversation with them. And then local government. What does local government do about housing? Well, a lot of stuff. So they actually implement rules about what can be built where, zoning, they administer public housing, they raise money for affordable housing. If the state allows, they implement one thing Medford City Council is doing right now is implementing an affordable housing trust, which actually collects money that they would then give out to housing development. The Community Preservation Act, which also gives money to affordable housing. They say yes or no to housing developers. It's a very important one. If a developer comes in and says, I want to put up these luxury condos everywhere, can I do that? It's often the city council that gets a saying whether they're able to do that. And local tenants' rights laws, notifying tenants of their rights. So this is something that Kit Collins has been working on, making sure that tenants are notified of their rights upon moving. That's oftentimes just as big of a problem as the rights themselves. These are your local government, the mayor, as well as 7 city councilors, 3 of whom are here today. Justin, Kit, Zach, right there. So please, if you have housing issues, talk to these folks during coffee hour. I'm sure they would absolutely love to hear your perspectives on it. And yeah, that's all I got right now. So thank you very much for listening to me, and I'm going to hand it off to Roberta.
Thank you, Matthew. I really learned a lot from that presentation. This is a different angle about affordable housing than what I have studied in years of looking at affordable housing. So I really appreciate that. And I hope that these, yes. Okay, I'm trying, yes, I will try to talk more into this mic. I'm also talking to the Zoom, which is on this computer. So I'm trying to address both audiences at the same time. And I hope that the slides will be made available to everyone here afterward who's provided an email, as well as everybody on Zoom, and we can post it on our Housing Medford Facebook page, which I would like to plug because there's so much information, more than what all of you can see from where you're sitting today. And it's really great information. So the topic of my presentation is bringing it local. So Matthew talked about kind of the national and international perspective on why housing is or is not affordable. And I'd like to talk about Medford specifically. And if you happen to not live in Medford, but live in another community, the story is very similar in every community around the state. And I maybe will comment a little bit on some communities have variations that are more or less than what we see in Medford. And maybe I can talk about that a little bit too, where it's relevant. But yeah, I'm going to bring it local. So I'm going to begin with some visualizations. Again, on the screen is a chart that you'll never be able to read from where you are, but I will interpret it for you. can you afford to live in Medford? Could you move here today if you didn't already have housing here in Medford? So on the screen, there's a bar chart, and the vertical bars represent the income of different, the income by industry for different types of jobs across the whole Boston region. This is 2021 data. And the horizontal bars represent the cost to to purchase a home in Medford is the top bar that's kind of orange, if you can see the color. The middle bar is the cost to rent an apartment in Medford, that's red if you can see the color. And the lowest bar is the cost to rent a room in Medford, which is green if you can see the color. So you can see that for many different types of occupations or kinds of jobs that people have across the Boston region, they may or may not be able to access housing at any of these levels. So on the far right, folks who can easily afford to purchase any kind of home, a condominium, by the way, that middle bar is for condominiums, not single family homes. So to be able to purchase a condominium or a single family house, these folks representing about 31% of jobs across the Boston region include finance and insurance, professional and technical services, people who work in the information industry, and people who work in management of businesses. So these are the folks who can afford to buy a home. And then people who are in the next middle group who can afford to access apartments or maybe buy a condo at market rates. These folks are, sorry, now I can't read either the screen or the, my notes are so tiny, about 25% of jobs pay in the income range that can afford market rate housing to rent or purchase an apartment. And these include people who work in government, people who work in construction industry, real estate, manufacturing, or utilities. Utilities meaning water, sewer infrastructure, working for the national grid and so forth. So those folks can afford to buy or rent at their income level. And then the next category down are folks who are struggling to be able to rent an apartment in Medford. And these folks include, by the way, there's one odd colored bar in the vertical bars. Those are seniors. They may not actually, that's the median income for seniors in the Boston area is somewhere in around the area of $50,000. Or that's the median income for seniors in Medford is around $50,000. So they are lumped into this category of people who are struggling to even be able to afford an apartment. And these include people who are retail workers, seniors, arts and recreation industry, business support services, not the management of businesses, transportation, healthcare, and education. So then at the bottom level, the people who can't even afford to rent a room are people who are in food services and hotel in particular. So the people who are working in restaurants and hotels are struggling to even be able to pay the rent for a room that they would rent on their own. So this is kind of a bleak picture of what it looks like to rent an apartment or to afford housing in Medford today. So to provide some pictures of what housing looks like, these on the screen are various examples of housing types that exist in Medford. These are all Medford homes across the city. From top left to bottom right, it goes older as you go toward the left and newer as you go toward the right. And the top row are all single family homes. And as you go down, they're larger multifamily homes. So in the middle are small the middle are small multifamily that includes 2-family, 3-family, older, small multifamily buildings, and newer townhouse condominiums. And then in the bottom, you can see different large apartment buildings. And most of them, you notice, are built fairly recently, maybe mid 20th century and forward. And so the next slide shows charts again that provide data that illustrates what we just saw photos of. The bar chart on the left, which you will not be able to read on the slide on the screen, but I'll describe it. And even the version when we post the slides will be hard to read. I'm working on updating this, but I don't have the data yet. So on the left shows the type of housing built by the era that was built. And what you can make out is that there was a period of time in which we were building a ton of housing and very diverse housing. You see this across communities, because I used to do this research on communities around the state, and I would always create this chart because it was so interesting. And you see this story played out everywhere. So there was a period of time up until about 1920, 1920s, 1930s at the most, when we were building a lot of housing. And then we just stopped. You can see it just like the next line down, we built practically no housing. And then when we started building housing again, it was mostly single family homes everywhere. So all those 2 families, 3 families, small apartment buildings, or a couple of houses on a lot, or mixed use with apartments over retail stores, all of that stopped. And then we, when we started building again, it was a monochrome, only single family homes everywhere. And then, as Matthew pointed out, around the middle of the 20th century, we began building some affordable housing. We began building some public housing. And then that was popular for a few decades, and then we stopped building public housing. And you can see in the chart, we began maybe building some condominiums, those townhouses we saw in the last slide, in the later part of the 20th century. Around 1990, housing development dropped off again. And this is partly due to the financial influences that Matthew talked about, and also partly due to changes in local laws that occurred around the states. Everybody got the idea at the same time that we don't want multifamily housing anywhere, and downzoned or changed the rules to prohibit multifamily housing wherever they could. And then we slowly have been building up more housing again through mechanisms that I'll talk about a little bit later. So that's kind of a picture of how we got to have the type of housing that you saw in the last slide. And just a little note on the right, a little bit about who lives here. We have about 58% renters and 42% homeowners in the state, and in Medford. And that's a little bit higher rate of renters than statewide. And that's common among cities. Suburban and rural communities have the opposite. They have more homeowners than renters, but it's typical for cities to have more renters than homeowners. And among renters and homeowners, young people in particular are much more likely to rent than own homes. Seniors are more likely to own their own homes than to rent, which is lucky for them. We saw in the first slide that seniors are likely to have very low incomes. So if about 75% of seniors own their own homes, that 25% of seniors who don't own their own homes and have that average income that's less than what they need to be able to rent an apartment, where are they? What are they doing? And so these are that's providing some data that backs up the stories that we may be seeing in our community. Next, I'm going to show a series of maps. This is another way of visualizing what the city looks like today. What's on the screen right now is a land use map. It's showing what type of land use exists around the city. Land use is whether something is housing, commercial, industrial development, and so forth. So to orient you, I want to speak to the folks on Zoom as well as all of you. I'd like to point out, I don't know if I can you see you can see the cursor, okay. So to orient you, I'm drawing the cursor along the Mystic River. You can see running through the center of the city from the northwest corner to the southeast corner. And then there's a white line kind of running up through the center of the picture, and that is Route 93. So that will orient you on the map of where we are. The lightest shade in this, and it's hard for those of you, especially in person, to see, the lightest shade is open space. We have a lot of open space in Medford. The whole northern section of the city is the Middlesex Fells. There's a lot of open space along the Mystic River as well. And also on the, not to forget, on the western side of the city, there's a large swath of open space that's the Brooks Estate. So then dark colors represent commercial, industrial, and non-residential uses. You can see that in particular in Medford Square and toward the West Medford Square on the west side of the city. And then this large area here that's around Wellington Circle, and then around the Sullivan train station on the east side of the city. And then there are also areas like the Mystic Avenue corridor you see on the south side. And if you look really close, there are a few places where commercial uses are mixed in with residential uses, particularly along, say, the Boston Avenue corridor. Main Street and Salem Street are examples of, historically, back in the early 20th century and beyond, it was common to mix commercial uses in with residential uses, and those are areas where we still see. So on the map, and this, you may be able to see this even from where you are. The lightest tan color is single family residential development. Houses are a little more spread apart in the neighborhoods that have the lightest tan color. And then a darker tan brown color is predominantly small multifamily, 2- and 3-family homes. And then the darkest brown color, which probably looks just like commercial development on the map that you're looking at, are larger multifamily homes. Next I'll talk a bit about city policy. The zoning is a set of city laws that make rules about what kinds of buildings can be built throughout the city. So what I'm showing now is a map of our zoning across the city. Zoning more or less preserves the pattern of development that we saw in the previous map. Although many times types of development that used to be allowed, as I talked about before we had zoning, are no longer allowed or are much harder to build today than they were because of changing the rules so that it reflects some vision that's different from what the city actually looked like before zoning. Zoning has made it much harder, as I mentioned before, to build any kind of multifamily housing or mixed use development with apartments over shops. And I would also note that our zoning in Medford was originally established in 1925. I don't have a clear picture of what it looked like in 1925, but I have a clear picture of the zoning map from 1965. And the map is identical to the map that we have today. Zoning in Medford has changed very little, definitely over the last 70 years, if not the last 100 years. Then I also want to acknowledge the role that federal government policy has had in promoting housing discrimination. That's also a factor in how the housing has gotten to look the way it does today in Medford and other communities. Maps prepared by a federal government agency in 1938 defined the risk of issuing mortgages to certain neighborhoods, largely based on the age and character of housing, the presence of multifamily homes, and the presence of minority populations. This contributed to a practice known as redlining, whereby residents in certain neighborhoods could not access financing to support investment in homeownership. You can learn more about redlining, the history of federal government discrimination in housing, and the impact that that has had on homeownership and the economy for people of color through a book entitled The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. So this map is the rating given to Medford neighborhoods. To orient you again, see if I can trace it on the screen. This line is the Mystic River running through the center of the city. Route 93 didn't exist at the time that this map was made. But here is Medford Square, kind of, you can see the confluence in the center. So Medford did not have any neighborhoods that were deemed hazardous at the time, but you can see that West Medford and the southern and eastern ends of Medford, which have traditionally had a higher proportion of minority and immigrant residents, were rated as declining according to this map. So next I want to talk a little bit about, move over to the side of how the city has been addressing the needs for affordable housing over time. I'm going to start in the 19th century, actually. On the upper left corner is a black and white picture of a house that was purchased in about 1856 or so, that's located, it was located where the high school and athletic fields are today. And this was purchased by the city to serve as the town farm. It was from the colonial times until sometime in the 20th century that I am not certain yet exactly how or when this happened. But for the first 300 years of our history, every city and town had a mandate to house, feed, and clothe residents who couldn't support themselves. And most communities, including Medford, had a town home of some type like this. The fire hydrant in the second picture at the top of the screen represents another piece of forgotten Medford affordable housing history. After World War II, the city constructed a village of temporary homes for veterans at the Brooks Estate. And not only homes for veterans, but they also converted the manor at the Brooks Estate into housing for elderly and disabled residents. So that was all dismantled sometime later in the 20th century, probably around the time that we began building public housing. And when about the time that our veterans were given incentives by the federal government to be able to purchase homes elsewhere, we dismantled all of that, and the Brooks Estate reverted to being the historic property that it is today. But you can still see those fire hydrants in the woods that supported that affordable housing. So later in the 20th century, the federal and state governments subsidized construction of the buildings owned by Medford Housing Authority, of which I have 3 examples on the screen. The pictures, the third and fourth pictures at the top, and the first picture at the bottom left are Medford Housing Authority properties. This only lasted for a few decades, as we talked about before. After about 1980, public housing construction essentially ended. So in recent decades, most new affordable housing, what little bit has been created in recent decades, was in mixed income developments where the city had an informal policy of asking private developers to include a few affordable units in an otherwise market rate housing development. So in the bottom right is an example of one of these recently built multifamily housing developments where we asked for a few units to be set aside, maybe 10% or 15% maybe of the units to be set aside as affordable. The center bottom image was actually from the conversion of former schools that the city owned to housing. These were mostly converted into condominiums, and a small handful of those condominiums were preserved as affordable units. So what are we doing today? Just a few notes about what our affordable housing initiatives and policies look like at the city level today. First, recently, I think in 2021, maybe 2020, we adopted inclusionary zoning, which formalized that requirement to include a few units of affordable housing in multifamily housing developments built by private developers. So creating a mixed income community in every large multifamily development that's built. Secondly, we have a few housing development proposals that have come to the city recently that are using Chapter 40B, which is a state mandate that also arrives at that mixed income housing development by private developers. This is 40B comes through a state mandate that overrides local zoning for housing development that creates some affordable units, at least 20% affordable units mixed with market rate development. And so we've also been putting some money toward affordable housing through adoption of the Community Preservation Act. We adopted Community Preservation Act in 2015 that sets some money aside every year that we can try to address our affordable housing needs. And we have also been doing some planning in the last few years through creating a housing production plan and a comprehensive plan for the city to identify strategies to try to address its housing needs. So what are the next steps for advocacy to go further at the local level toward affordable housing? We need to change zoning and carry out those plans that we've developed by changing zoning and other regulations. We need to put more money toward affordable housing through the creation of an affordable housing trust and gathering money from more money from a wider variety of sources that we can contribute toward affordable housing. We need to increase capacity to build and manage affordable housing by increasing the staff in City Hall and also by recruiting nonprofit organizations to build housing in Medford and to meet our housing needs in Medford. And finally, but not least of all, what Viva Urbana is doing here today is supporting people through tenant protection, housing stability, and through homelessness, addressing the needs of people in our community who have no housing. So that concludes my comments. Thank you very much.
I just want to say before I write the speaker, I believe our State Senator Pat Jehlen walked in. I recognize that you're a mask. You want to stand up, Pat? Because you do a lot for affordable housing. I know it's on her agenda. She's someone we can talk about. And Liza Maloney, who was leading the Tenants group for a period of time. And okay, let's stand up. Liza. All right. Next speaker.
Thanks, Susan. Hello. I'm going to keep my portion relatively short. This is like we've had the sermon, and now we're at the now we're at the portion where we ask for offerings metaphorically, and then we get to a benediction, the call to action. What I think I want everyone here to feel is powerful for a couple of reasons. Everyone showed up on a Saturday to sit inside a Unitarian church and learn about housing and grow their power in knowledge. You will leave the sanctuary more powerful than you came into it because you have knowledge. You are already powerful for two reasons. A, I imagine most of you are members of UU Medford, so you have relationships with each other. And if you're not, you're in a place that is grounded in strong relationships. And you have power because you have stories to tell about your own housing struggles and your friends' housing struggles. You in fact probably have enough power here to make a pretty significant difference on a lot of housing issues locally. Many of you just came from a rally that I, as a resident of Brighton, am beginning to learn about, where you're making a really serious difference in the lives of tenants who are being forced out of housing. You are pooling your power and you are directing it towards acting in the street and drawing attention to a serious issue. A lot of housing problems, frankly, can be solved by drawing attention into the right places. There's a lot of local power here. I'm going to talk briefly about how GBIO, which UU Medford is a member of, is looking at marshaling statewide power to address a couple of the housing issues in the upcoming legislative session. The Greater Boston Interfaith Organization operates off the theory of change that the relationships inside houses of worship are some of the strongest relationships and therefore some of the most powerful relationships that exist. We are made up of 60-ish temples, mosques, synagogues, and recently the Boston Teachers Union and SEIU 1199 as well. There's some, we're getting a little more secular because it's similar power in labor unions that can be found in congregations too. And we are not a single issue organization. We listen to the needs of our member institutions, and every few years we figure out where to direct our power as 60 Boston area institutions at the state level. And right now we're attempting to corral that power towards a housing justice campaign to work on actually a number of the things that Roberta hinted at. More money for affordable housing on a broad level, more land for affordable housing, and building up local leaders like a lot of the folks here to act locally and realize, oh, I could be part of fixing this myself. I'm going to briefly touch on GBIO's proposed housing justice campaign, which will look at directing the relationship we've got inside all of our member institutions towards the relationships we have at the State House. We are not particularly, we're not often to be found outside picketing or standing in front of the governor's mansion, though those tactics can be effective. We often organize and roll out our power by calling our representatives, by going out to coffee with them and building a relationship to try and get a few things changed. Our present proposed housing justice campaign takes on a couple of things. Empowering local leaders to get involved with zoning, particularly around MBTA stations. I know Medford is looking at the MBTA Community Rezoning Act and is actually pretty close to being in compliance with it already. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it. Suffice it to say, we have a lot of member institutions in Lexington, Wellesley, and Needham, and places that have no multifamily housing. And we are working on empowering energies there to create some new zones for it. At the state level, we are in our research within our institutions, working with housing policy experts and people who are just good at spending a lot of time on the State House's website. We have come to the conclusion that the real estate transfer fee bill is one of the most potent pieces of housing legislation out there right now. There's a lot of other solutions, but right now, the transfer fee bill, were it to pass, would allow cities and towns around the state to impose a fee on certain real estate transactions and pull some of the money out of high-end real estate transactions into an affordable housing trust fund, something that Roberta hinted to. In Boston, if there was a real estate transfer fee, 6 buildings that went up in the last 3 years could have added over $2 million to Boston's housing trust fund. So we're not talking about putting a tax on every sale of property in a specific town. It is about a city making a decision for itself. How much are we willing to say developers need to put back into the community if essentially flipping high-end real estate values. And then the last area that we're proposing to act in is one that has sort of fallen by the wayside in a lot of housing activism and advocacy over the last few years. And in one of Matt's charts, it fell to the wayside in the amount of construction energy put towards it, and that's public housing. We in GBIO discovered in the last 3 years that we have more public housing tenants in our member organizations than we thought. And when we did a listening campaign 3 years ago, and we said, what's getting everybody down? What is making your life more difficult than it should be? We learned that across the board, conditions in most public housing developments are pretty darn abysmal. And there is a really potent political opportunity, a once in 5 year political opportunity to significantly increase the conditions in statewide public housing. I'm gonna briefly ask my friend Morse, who knows a lot more about this and has been engaged much more in tenant organizing, to speak briefly about this opportunity we're considering at the state level.
Thanks. I hope folks online can also hear. I usually get told that my voice is loud enough, so I'm hoping it will be. I'm Nick Morse. I am a congregant at Temple Israel in Boston, one of the charter members of GBIO. And first, just want to welcome UU Medford to GBIO. It's always great when one of the things that motivates me to be a part of GBIO is the opportunity to come and at least a little bit see and meet folks from our other congregations. I didn't know anything special about housing until about 1.5 years ago. And in Brookline, we were challenged to organize our GBIO congregations locally to find ways to improve the housing situation in Brookline, a notoriously expensive and difficult housing market, but also one that actually devotes a fair amount of resources, not enough, but some, to both finding ways to create affordable housing and to public housing. Let me just summarize. Public housing is less on the radar screen of most of these affordable housing conversations, for good reason in some ways, because it impacts, I think, most people who are congregants at institutions like ours, not so much. But here's the brief overview, and I apologize not having slides, but I actually didn't know I was going to speak today. So there are upwards of 70,000 public housing units in the state of Massachusetts, and they house more than 100,000 people. About a little more than 50% are state-funded public housing units, while about a little less than 50% are federally funded public housing units. And the funding for those are totally separate, but both kinds of public housing are administered by housing authorities that are localized to different communities. One thing that I learned that was surprising to me, your local Medford Housing Authority has no relationship, no formal relationship to your local government. It is not a part of the Medford city government. It is a state agency, part of a state agency called the Department of Housing and Community Development. There are 242 separate housing authorities across the state. And this is actually good news, because that means there are these local but powerful authorities that span the influence of public housing and administer it and know what the real problems are. We saw in Brookline, we learned from folks who were living in public housing who were a part of GBIO, many through Union Capital Boston, that the conditions in many public housing developments were really unacceptable. There were terrible problems with vermin, rats and mice and cockroaches. There was maintenance that had been deferred literally for decades, like much of the other public infrastructure in our country that was just crumbling. You know, heat didn't work, windows were deteriorating. The administration of the maintenance and support for public housing units and public housing residents, many very dedicated people, a lack of efficient organization, and huge underfunding. Briefly, just to sum it up, for the past 40 years, the average allocation from the state government for the support of maintenance of public housing, of state-funded public housing in the state of Massachusetts, about 35% of what any reasonable person would say was necessary. And for capital funding, just to, you know, for the basic, big, you know, mechanical and structural upgrades that you need if you're going to have something that continues to stand and doesn't get condemned, also about a third of what is needed. So that chronic underfunding is a big part, not the only part, but a big part of what's led to our problem. And as one of our tenant leaders put it very eloquently and simply, folks who live in public housing, mostly, if they lose public housing, they are homeless. And so from the point of view of everybody here, this is a population that if we lose our public housing, and once it gets condemned as unlivable, it's never going to come back. So if we lose our public housing, we're going to have a spike in our homeless population, and that's going to be much more expensive and much less effective for us to deal with. So that's sort of the state of public housing. I'd love to talk to anybody who has more questions, but I thank you very much for giving me a few moments of your time.
That was useful. I don't hold as many numbers in my brain as Nick does. I'll give just a quick coda then. So public housing is part of our proposed housing justice campaign. And my ask and hope for you Medford folks here, and well, really, and friends, is to come help GBIO caucus this out and really connect it to our moral traditions and our religious traditions. Are we going to, as an organization, go all out on housing justice for the next legislative cycle? That's going to be on November 10th, that delegates assembly. It'll be both on Zoom and in person. Would really encourage you to talk to Matt if you're interested in attending and working through and modifying this campaign. And then considering where you want to put the power you have as a resident, the power you have as a voter, the power you have as a taxpayer, and deciding if putting it towards state advocacy is a place that you want to direct it. I think the folks who are speaking next have a different way and a different theory of change about where you can direct your power in a really potent way locally too. So I'm glad we've got a couple of menu of options here. But yeah, I hope that you leave here feeling and knowing that you're more powerful than you came in.
Hi, my name is Katie McCann, and I'm a community organizer at City Life Viva Urbana, along with my colleague Eduardo Palacios, who will be speaking in a minute as well. City Life is a grassroots community organization led by working class people of color that's based in Boston, but that organizes throughout the greater Boston area. And we're focused on housing justice. We're focused on organizing against evictions and foreclosures, and organizing for housing stability across communities. And Eduardo and I are the organizing team for Malden, Medford, and Everett. And we're here today. Unfortunately, one of the tenant leaders from the Bradlee Road Tenant Association, who many of you joined in a rally earlier today, she was not able to be here, but in a moment, Eduardo is going to read a speech from Kristen, one of the tenant leaders there, and I'll just briefly kind of speak about the larger context. So the tenants at Bradlee Road are organizing against no-fault evictions by a corporate landlord, Savage Realty. And they are now the last household that is fighting these evictions. Many of the neighbors came together to organize, and we've supported them in forming a tenant association, and they are still organizing to be able to stay, both for an agreement so that they can stay in their home long-term, but also for compensation for their neighbors who've been displaced, and for long-term leases for their neighbors who are still in the building, but who will likely receive large rent increases, the tenants who are on leases and the not tenants at will before. But this fight at Bradlee Road, and also another fight in Malden, where we're organizing in a building owned by United Properties, where tenants are fighting $900 rent increases. Both of these show why, while it's important for us to keep organizing building by building, we need larger scale solutions. We need to lift the ban on rent control statewide, which passed, the real estate industry passed very narrowly through a ballot initiative in 1994, as many of you know. And since then, the cities and towns do not have the power to enact rent control, enact any form of regulations on rent. They don't have the power to ban no-fault evictions, which are currently legal in Massachusetts, and they don't have the power to enact other tenant protections as well. And so we really need to lift that ban, because we will continue to organize building by building, and there are many ways to get involved. We have some flyers out in the front that have information to sign a petition for the Bradlee Road Tenant Association and a rent control pledge. And if you're interested in getting more involved with tenant organizing in Medford, there are many ways to get involved, and you can come talk with us afterwards, and we can share contact information. But this, these no-fault evictions and enormous rent increases show that it's not enough to just fight this on a building level and fight each corporate landlord. We really need larger scale solutions, and we really appreciate the work that Senator Jehlen and the 3 city councilors here are doing to push for that at all levels of government. And so we really need to, especially going into this next legislative cycle, we really need to push even harder to try to lift this ban and try to, get all the tools that we can to create more tenant protections and stop this mass wave of displacement. And so now Eduardo is going to speak. He's going to read Kristen's speech that she wrote and that she read earlier today at the rally. Again, thank you to everybody who joined us earlier. And he's also going to talk about our organizing work. He's also a leader in the Maplewood Square Tenants Association in Malden, and came to us when he was organizing against eviction in his building, and came together with his neighbors and won an agreement through collective bargaining. And so, I'm going to turn it over to him now. Thank you.
I'm nervous. Walking in here, I was like, whoa, this is a church, right? Well, hi, how's everybody doing today? My name is Eduardo Palacios. I am a part-time community organizer in City Life now, which is great. I feel like I could give back to the community that helped me so much. Quick story to run through the personal side of having non-affordable housing. I was born in Florida. Born in California, raised in Florida. Young, dumb, full of myself. I ended up incarcerated at the age of 16, charged as an adult, facing life in prison. By the grace of God, or the powers that be, I only served 5 years. And I got out 21 years old, August 31st, 2012. September 1st, the very first day of my freedom, I was served 5-year eviction notice. This is in Florida. In 72 hours, the sheriffs will come and remove my mother, myself, and my sister from where we were living. It was terrifying. I didn't know what to do. I had spent my childhood in prison. I had no idea how to come up with first, last security deposit in 3 days. The community helped me. There were people in the community that had their own construction companies, and they said, you work with me and I'll split it 50-50 with you. And thank God everything worked out. Fast forward 10 years.
Last year, I'm at the point where I'm about to celebrate 10 years of being free. I was excited, I was happy. I've been able to prove to myself that I became a different man. And I was living in Maplewood Square in Malden, where I was paying $12.50 a month, which was not bad, right? Like she said, I work in the kitchen industry, so I wasn't making enough so I can just go out and splurge and live in a better place. But I loved the little place that I had. I had a kitchen, I had a living room, I had my home. This was my home. The property sold, and they wanted to tear the building down. So it was obvious what we had to do. We had to leave, and it was scary because it's like, once again, I'm facing this eviction, and this time it's not because I wasn't prepared for it. I've been doing everything right. I've been working hard. I've been staying out of trouble, and here's another eviction, and it was terrifying. It was like, what do I do now? I don't have the money saved up. I don't even make enough to say I can save up the money for this. Like, I'm barely living paycheck to paycheck. How am I going to make it out of this? And City Life came. They helped me and Tati, my neighbor. She's a great organizer. She was the first one to organize, and she told me, let's organize. And I said, why? Well, we have to fight. How? These people have millions and millions of dollars. How do we fight against that? They have lawyers. And what do we have? No, we're going to stand outside and protest. What is standing outside holding a sign going to do for us? Like, our time is running out, and eventually, having nothing else to do, I said, okay, fine, I'm in it. If I'm going to be in it, I'm going to be deep in it. You tell me what I need to do, and I'll do whatever I can. And lo and behold, months later, we signed a fair agreement. And it came from the power of organizing, of people of the community standing together and saying, this is not right. This is not just. There's no reason why a person should be going through this. It's not, and the thing that we fight a lot are no-fault evictions, which means that people are being evicted, not because, they're destroying the building, because they're selling drugs out of it, or being a bad tenant. It's just because they want them out. Or most people, as she said, there's people facing $900 rent increases. Even in Medford, we were having issues with another building where they were facing $350, $400 $400 in rent increases, and they were mostly seniors. So their income is fixed. Like, how do I go about coming up with the rest of this money? Do I move, or what do I do? And it's sad that the greed of corporations are greater than the needs and wants of the community. And over, from Medford to Malden to Dorchester to Mattapan, all over the state of Massachusetts, it's happening when people are being pushed out of their communities, their homes, the cities they've lived in and built, dug the roots in, because somebody wants to come in and just make more profit. The only thing now is profits. How much money can I make if I rent this much? My brother, who has a home in Chelsea, someone from real estate came to speak to him about selling his home. He didn't want to sell. He said, well, how much did you rent each unit for? He said, oh my God, you can charge double that. And, this is what they go. That's all they see is what things could go for. They see, well, if he's charging this much here, I can charge this much here. And our lives is nowhere near the importance level of their greed. We were going through the eviction, everybody seemed to forget that we're humans. There was a personal story being lived in that moment, and everyone just saw a contract. Well, they bought, or they sold, they bought, this is their property, get out. And it's like, well, it goes beyond just that. And as we fight at 22 Bradlee, it's the same exact thing, where people are just being pushed out for just greed. They just want to make as much as they can from the communities that they just extract from and never benefit or give back to. So it's powerful for me to be here. I'm thankful for City Life Urbana. I'm thankful for the community, for everybody that always shows up, and just does what's right. I think that if the world just did what was right, and not, how much profit I can make out of it, it'd be a better world in general. With that being said, I'm going to read this letter from Kristen, who we had a rally for them today. And like I said, I'm nervous, so I'm studying all over the place. I'm sorry, all right? Unfortunately, being forced out of our home is not new to us. The first apartment we lived in together was in a house in Austin, and we found out just a few months after we moved in that house, it was being sold and we had to leave. We then moved to Medford. Rent in 2008 was $900. We lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in a 3-family home with a dining room, a porch, and our own driveway. 6 months after moving in, the building was sold. We were told that we needed to move out. We then moved to Bradlee Road into a much smaller apartment for close to what we had paid for a 2-bedroom only a month earlier. After our first year as tenants, we quickly became used to yearly rent increases. We worried that Medford was becoming unaffordable for us, but felt secure being longtime tenants here at Bradlee Road. This past March, a year after Select Properties bought the building, we, along with 17 other at-will tenants, received a notice to quit. Tenants on leases were asked to sign new leases with hundreds of dollars in rent increases. Apartments that were once affordable are now being renovated and rented out at nearly 100% increase of our current rent. When we received a notice to quit, we immediately started looking for a new apartment and saw that we could no longer afford to live in Medford or even the surrounding areas. People like me who rely on public transportation to get to work now have to move further away and face a complicated and much longer commute. Soon enough, those cities will also become unaffordable, just as Medford did. Residents of Massachusetts will be pushed further out, while cities like Medford continue to put up luxury condos and take away affordable housing. We need to stop these corporate mammoths from buying up all the properties just to push out working class people. We need rent control to prevent people from being forced out of their homes due to unreasonable rent increases. We need economic justice for the people of Medford, for Massachusetts, and for anyone who does not want to be pushed out of their homes. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everybody, very much for coming out here today. And now I think we can have a Q&A session using the very nice mic that we have set up there. If Stephen wants to just hand the mic to anybody that might have a question. And
You speak right into the mic.
also just address who you want to address.
When you think are seeking to be elected in government, it's going to go with any proposal.
Who would like to take that one on?
She keeps her cards pretty close to her chest. Hard to tell.
I'll just briefly add a little bit of participation and say that she supports the idea of looking down. So I'm not sure beyond that, but and there's one thing I'll say about the food ban too. The rent control if there's different forms. So rent control can look and there's many different forms of rent control. So looking again and then allows different towns to decide what that to. So, it's not like one policy.
Is there any consideration
The question was, are there any caps on Airbnb to increase supply of housing?
I'll address that. I'll address that. And I can't speak for what our local or state legislators are talking about doing, but Airbnb and VRBO have very different effects in different communities. And so it's, I think, a very local issue whether they are actually impacting the local housing supply or not impacting the local housing supply. There are reasons why short-term rentals actually contribute. They are a part of the local housing market. People who have very small housing units, who have visitors come to visit them because they have such a small housing unit, may need there to be a supply of short-term rentals. People who are studying in the community or come for short-term work for medical treatment. There are many reasons why people need to have rental opportunities that are not a hotel. And so there ought to be some legal limitations and boundaries around the short-term rental market, but there's not in some places that are such as the Cape and islands that are have a huge tourism draw. The short-term rentals really are taking away from the local housing market. But in places where the only people visiting here are people who have business here, or have family here, or have a reason to come to this neighborhood, this community, those short-term rentals are contributing to the local economy, not necessarily competing with the local economy. So I just encourage the idea that short-term rentals really need to be considered as a local issue and not a statewide issue.
We're getting a notice from our Zoom coordinator. If you ask a question using this mic, please speak loudly and slowly and right into the mic.
I'm sorry, I got on the first question today. Since the ban on reputable case law, it's a government power.
Speak into the phone.
Yes, the State House does have the power to lift the ban, and then the government, that would then go to the governor after, so yes. And the bill to lift the ban in the previous legislative session made it favorably out of the Housing Committee for the first time. So it has made progress, and we're really trying to grow this campaign, especially going into the next legislative session.
Well, I have a question, Bill. Since we need to have some positive stories, I thought we'd like to speak a little bit about what GBIO succeeded in doing for housing.
Yeah, the question Susan had was could I offer a story of a win? And I'm sure that CLDU has several stories of wins too. Eduardo alluded to some of them. But organizing works at both the local tenant level and you can there are stories of developers essentially being publicly shamed into stopping evicting people. I think one of the biggest wins GBIO has had was with American Rescue Plan funding. This was a large amount of COVID relief money that Boston wound up getting, and we had tenants in one specific development, just one development in Boston, where people's bathtubs were falling through their ceiling. This was the Mildred C. Haley Apartments in Jamaica Plain. That got together, went to the Boston Housing Authority and said, what's your number? What do you need as an immediate preventative investment here? And she said, you're never going to get it. It's $50 million. That's our low number. And so we got our 40-odd Boston institutions together and had a forum with then candidate for Mayor Wu and her opponent, and said, if you get into office, we need $50 million of COVID relief money to stabilize the Mildred C. Haley Apartments. And we organized enough constituent power to get a yes from both candidates. And then that was one of the first budget items that she signed back in January of this year. So they're getting new elevators and new ceilings and all that good stuff. On the other hand, that is one development in one housing authority in the state. But it was a win. Organizing works.
Yes, my name is Stephen. I have a secretary problem.
So the question is, for people who have Section 8 housing vouchers that the government will pay for a portion of the rent, for apartments. New housing development, often the rents are too high for Section 8 voucher holders to be able to use their vouchers. And that's not only new development. Market rate housing everywhere across the city is too expensive. It charges more than what the government is willing to underwrite the cost of, so that a Section 8 voucher holder can use their voucher to live in an apartment in Medford. So what we need to do is to get more housing that's affordable. People will complain that, so housing is defined as being affordable if it is targeted at households meeting a certain income level. 80% of area median income is considered by the state to be an affordable unit. And a lot of people will protest that at 80% of area median income, that apartment is still too expensive for most people to be able to afford. However, at 80% of area median income, usually that is the income level that a Section 8 voucher can be affordable to. So when we create 80% area median income housing, we're creating housing that voucher holders can access. So it's very important to increase housing at any affordability level, particularly 80% and below, because with people at lower income levels, it's so expensive to cover the gap between what they can afford and what the market rate is, that we need to have multiple subsidies from multiple sources to make that apartment affordable enough. So that 80% area median income affordability level that a private developer will donate is one subsidy. And on top of that, your housing voucher is a second subsidy. And we need to create more of those units that are affordable at that income level. Yes.
I want to check.
Is the computer microphone?
I just think I'll talk right now. Okay.
One thing we haven't talked as much about that I'm really interested in, I was hoping maybe our CLVU colleagues could talk about, is removing currently private housing that's on at market rate, taking it off the speculative market. I know there was a really big win in East Boston the other week where, tens of millions of dollars in funding came together to create partnering with the Community Development Corporation to bring, dozens, if not hundreds of units off the market. I was wondering if you could talk more about that.
Yeah, so one of the things that City Life organizes to do, we use a model that we call the sword, the shield, and the offer. And the sword represents public pressure and protest like we were doing today. And the shield is legal defense and our partnership with lawyers. And the offer is the long-term, large-scale solutions that we're fighting for. And so sometimes that looks like a 5-year collective bargaining agreement in a building. Sometimes that looks like winning policies like rent control that regulate the market and protect, a lot of people in their homes right now. And really one of the biggest goals that we work toward that creates the most true form of housing stability is getting buildings out of the for-profit market, and especially getting those buildings to be community controlled, being part of a land trust or part of some other model where the residents and other community members have control and decision-making power over what happens with those buildings. And so, yeah, recently we had a very big victory of getting, I believe it was 36 buildings out of the for-profit market in East Boston. And these were buildings where City Life had been organizing with tenants who were facing enormous rent increases, mostly immigrant tenants. This is going to stabilize many families who've been facing displacement out of East Boston, some who'd already been displaced out of East Boston and are now going to be able to come back. And most importantly, this is going to be permanently affordable. So this is not something that we're going to have to fight again in 5 years or in whatever amount of time. But so that's really we need to be working toward all of these different solutions, at once. Like we need, large scale policies that will, stop these huge rent increases right now and regulate the market, but we also really need to be getting housing out of the for-profit market and into the control of the community, whether it's housing owned by community land trusts or community development corporations or other nonprofits or other, combination models like the East Boston models. So that's definitely something really important. And that's always when we're organizing with a building, when tenants come to us and they're facing eviction, especially when the entire building is facing eviction, we always look into whether it's possible to make a purchase like that, and whether there are certain nonprofits that we can partner with to make that kind of purchase. And so the other thing is there needs to be more funds on every level of government, both on city level and like the city of Boston has, and the state level, to help nonprofits and community land trusts make these purchases to keep housing permanently affordable. So that's another policy on both city and state levels that we need, is that we need more funding for nonprofits to purchase housing to make it permanently affordable.
Right. Yep, that's what I was coming here to do. Somebody asked, are these stats for individuals or families? Okay. I believe this was addressed to Roberta. Jennifer Sullivan on Zoom asked, are these stats for individuals or families? That was during.
I'm just gonna flip back to the slide that I think so I'm going to assume that the question was, are the stats for individuals or families? And I'm going to assume that that pertains to the slide, the first slide that I showed with data. These are for jobs. So the blue columns represent jobs. So that's an individual's job. And I meant to also, I've been thinking about it, I meant to point out that, so for people who cannot individually be able to afford housing, obviously, they may be in households with multiple income levels. So that 30% of jobs that are in that can't quite afford an apartment range, those are the folks who by and large are roommates. So they're getting apartments together, they're combining, whether they are whether they're families or couples or unrelated people who are housing together, but that's how they're able to find housing, is by having more than one income to be able to pay for the rent of an apartment. Thanks.
Just gotta check really quickly. Not seeing it. Okie dokie. So I believe that concludes the meeting. So I would like to thank everybody very much for coming out on a Saturday, spending your time to learn about and to support this important issue. We have coffee and some food in the back. If you'd like to hang out for a little bit more, chat with us, and just have a very nice afternoon tea if you like. Thank you very much again. It's through that door, by the way.
Oh, cool. Let's hear about that.